So today we have two main speakers. They are Dr. Alexander Osterwalder and Professor Yves Pigneur, who just recently launched their book, The Invincible Company, and then they're going to share about this book in their keynotes today. So my name is Dina Kosasi. I'm from Innovesia. I'll be moderating the webinar. I'm going to introduce the speaker's profile later and also moderating the Q&A session. First, let me say hi to our speaker, which they are attending the session as well as presenting the keynotes from Switzerland, which I think like about 5 hours difference from Indonesia, right? Probably Yves and Alex, you want to say hi first?
Hello.
Okay, thank you. And it's good to have you here. And I hope you're doing well as well. So I hope everyone is doing great in this pandemic condition and also stay in productive ways. Before we start the webinar, I would like to inform you some of the house rules that we are applying for everyone to actually pay attention to. First of all, this webinar session is recorded, and then during the session, everyone is set on muted mode. And you can start writing your question for the Q&A session when the speakers start their keynote presentation. And when you are posting your question, please do not post or show obscene, insensitive, and immoral content in the Q&A section or chat section. And then during the Q&A session, please ask questions only related to the topic. So please don't ask what Alex is having for breakfast today, or like what I'm having for breakfast, or like what I'm having for dinner. Okay, and in addition, this webinar also like to encourage you to make some donation to help medical personnel and people who are affected by COVID-19 in Indonesia through Yayasan Kita Bisa. You can directly scan the QR code on the right side or directly transfer to the bank account shown here. Now, let me introduce you to the organizations that organize this webinar. The first one is Strategyzer. Strategyzer is a corporate innovation company that provides technical tools to help people understand customers, design better value proposition, and find the right business model. Strategyzer makes it easy for people to rapidly sketch business model ideas with the business model canvas and the value proposition canvas. And the second organization is Indonesia, which Strategyzer is partnering with for this webinar. Innovesia is the innovation accelerator for startups, corporations, and organizations. We provide end-to-end innovation process from idea inception, prototyping, to implementation, market validation, and funding. Innovation has proven expertise in applying agile methods such as design thinking or human-centered design, design sprint, business model, Scrum, Lean Startup, Scamper, and etc. Let me check again. Okay, so I think it's time for me to introduce the speaker's profile. First, the speaker is Dr. Alexander Osterwalder, or is known as Alex. Dr. Alexander Osterwalder is a leading author, entrepreneur, and in-demand speaker whose work has changed the way established companies do business and how new ventures get started. He is ranked number 4 of the top 50 management thinkers worldwide. Osterwalder also holds the Thinkers 50 Strategy Award. He invented the business model canvas, value proposition canvas, and business portfolio map together with Yves Pigneur, practical tools that are trusted by millions of business practitioners from leading global companies. His books include the international bestseller, Business Model Generation, Value Proposition Design, Testing Business Ideas, and the Invincible Companies. I'd like to ask the participants, like, how many of you have bought these books already? Because I have. Okay, the next speaker is Professor Yves Pigneur. Sorry. So Professor Yves Pigneur is honorary professor at University of Lausanne, HEC. He is considered a mastermind among business strategics. His tools have been used by numerous companies such as P&G, Amazon, and Tesla. He is the co-creator of the Value Proposition Canvas and the Business Model Canvas. He is ranked number 4 of the top 50 management thinkers worldwide. Pigneur and Osterwalder also hold the Thinkers 50 Strategy Award. So about the keynote presentation, as we know, basically, Strategyzer recently launched their latest book, The Invincible Company. You can buy directly at Strategyzer website, www.strategyzer.com. And Alex and Yves will share about the book shortly. So during the keynote presentation, you can actually post questions on the Q&A sections with the following format: name, institution or company, your question, and then whom you want to address the question to. And now, if everyone is ready, and Alex, I believe, is ready as well. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite the speakers to present the keynotes. So Alex and Yves, I'd like to over to you.
Okay, great. So pleasure to meet everybody, even if it's just virtually. So we're going to talk about the Invincible Company. I'm going to introduce a little bit the concepts of this new book. Some of you might be familiar with our older work, the business model generation, value proposition design, testing business ideas, etc. So in this new book, we arrogantly chose the title, How to Become an Invincible Company. Now, no company can be invincible, but you can stay ahead of everybody else if you constantly reinvent yourself. So we found 3 characteristics of invincible companies. Number 1, they constantly reinvent themselves. They don't just lay back and say, hey, we're successful. No, actually you need to reinvent yourself while you're successful. Number 2, invincible companies, they compete on superior business models. They don't just have great products, maybe new technologies, great services. They have superior business models. And the third one is that they often transcend industry boundaries. So you can't put them into banking, finance, mining or so. They break out of those industry boundaries and they play in arenas. So question, of course, is how do you become an invincible company? And that's what we're going to talk about. And I think it's a very, very timely topic as well, because we could replace the word invincible with resilience. And we do believe that the companies that work, like we're going to show you a little bit, are much more resistant to big shocks like the one we have now, which is, of course, is a very big shock, one in 150 years. Now, we just go quickly back to the third point that I mentioned, transcending industry boundaries. If you look at the big industry disruptions today, they often come from the edges of the system. So Vinod Khosla, founder of Sun Microsystems, he likes to say that those innovations, they rarely come from the big companies. They come from the edges. And there's a reason for that, and I don't think it has to stay like that. The big reason is that, excuse me, it's a challenge for most companies to really, really deeply innovate. And when I say innovate, I'm thinking beyond technology, beyond the typical R&D, research and development, really coming up with new value propositions and new business models. And the reason is very simple, is that most companies, once they become successful, they focus on managing the existing, okay? And that's important, but it's not enough when the world around you is changing rapidly. You need to explore at the same time that you're world-class at execution, exploitation, and management. So this is a lot more about searching for new potential businesses of tomorrow. Now, we break that down into an exploration journey for new ideas. And again, not just technology. You don't need technology necessarily to innovate. Can be, doesn't have to be. That's about the search for new business models. And there are 2 elements in searching business models. One is designing better business models, and the other one is testing them constantly. So we'll go into that a little bit. And then once you've found a great new business model, while you're still successful, you grow them and you manage them. And sometimes, of course, and that's what we're going to talk about, you have several business models. But let me zoom into first just a little bit of repetition. Business model canvas, we started that 20 years ago, published it 10 years ago. Every company has a value proposition that they offer certain segments. They reach the customers here through distribution channels. Then you establish a relationship. Okay, then you need things in your backstage to actually be able to offer this value proposition. What are the most important key activities you need to perform? What are the most important resources you need to have? And who are the partners you work with for this? So front stage, I like to call this backstage. And then the last one, just again, quick repetition from our work 10 years ago, the profit formula, which is all about how do you earn money and what does this all cost? And that's a result of what we have on the top, right? So you can see this little tool that we created 20 years ago and published 10 years ago in a book gives you the big picture of a business model. So that's a repetition, but we think it's still important today because not very many companies are good at competing on business models. They still compete on product, price, and technology. That's not enough. So what we're going to look at in this little talk, the content of our new book, Strategy and Portfolio Management. So how do you actually create this invincible company? And then I'm going to zoom into competing on business models. That's why I gave you a little bit of repetition of the business model canvas. And then, of course, the last one, and this is the hardest one for most established companies. And when I say established, it can be a small company with 30, 60, 100 people, or a very large one with 30,000, 300,000, or like Amazon, almost 1 million people. So you need to establish an innovation culture. Let's start with the first one. And for that, I'm going to hand over to Yves, if I can unshare my screen and give Yves the virtual podium. So,
yeah. Hello. So strategy and portfolio management first. You have seen Alex has presented this idea of ambidextrous company, good in exploitation and exploration. So based on this idea, we decided to have or to manage two different portfolios. One is the exploit portfolio, for which we have here on this axis the return, the high return, low return. So it means that if a business model is here, he has a high return. And also to manage this idea of disruption risk, here it's a lower risk, here it's a high risk. So if a business model is at this level, is low risk, high return. If it's here, it's high risk, low return. And so we have a second portfolio for the exploration, where we have all the business model that we are explore, and if they are good, we will switch them at this level with also two different dimensions. One is not the real return, but expected return, because we don't know at this stage. And the second axis is not the disruption risk, but innovation risk. So we don't know exactly if it will work, but we hope that it will be good. So I will visit those two different portfolios. First, the exploitation portfolio, and I will just illustrate it. I will illustrate it very quickly with Nestle, and based on its annual report last year, we can use the portfolio to show that we have here the the highly contributing business model, which is beverage. Okay, so 20 billion annual revenue. And here we have the lowest contribution, which is water with 7 billion. That's first. On this axis here, they have detected some business model which are at risk, such as here cosmetic, food for baby, milk in Asia, and meat. And so they have decided to fix those business models, means to improve them, trying to push this on the right-hand side, maybe on the top. Managing this portfolio means that sometimes you have also to divest some of those business models. They have divested US confectionery and also a life insurance company. And the third main actions that you could have on a portfolio in your portfolio management is to acquire some company. And they have decided 2 years ago to acquire Blue Bottle, which is a kind of Californian Starbucks company. They have decided to acquire the license, the worldwide license of Starbucks, meaning that it's possible to sell those Starbucks inside retailers. They have acquired Atrium, which is a biotech company, Tails.com, which is e-commerce for pet food, and so on. So this is roughly how we can see how to manage a exploit portfolio. And at this level, we need something. We have discovered that it's very easy to decide where to put those business model on this axis, because you have the books, you have the numbers, you have the P&L. So it's quite easy to say, okay, this business model is 20 billion, this one is 7. But one of the big issue is, how is it possible to put those business model on those axes with low risk, high risk? And so we came with a risk assessment sheet, if you want, with a lot of questions that's possible to aggregate and to decide where those business models are fixed on this axis here on the disruption risk. And so based on this one, it's possible to take decisions in managing your portfolio, improving, putting this on the right-hand side on the top, acquiring business model or divesting business model. Okay, so this one was for the exploit portfolio, execution portfolio. On the exploration side, we have another portfolio, and I will briefly illustrate with another company inside the Nestlé group, which is Nespresso. Long time ago, Eric Favre has an idea to create this machine with the capsule, coffee inside capsules, and he designed a business model, which is mainly B2B, business to business. And he persevered during a couple of years. And in 1987, Nestlé was on the verge to kill this project, to stop this project. They had this impression that it was not a good business model for them. But they were hesitating, and so they changed the CEO of the company. Jean-Claude Gaillard came. He pivoted completely the business model. He tested, and they have been convinced that this B2B, a B2C, with a direct access to customers, kind of e-commerce, if you want, or mail order company, was quite good. They tested, they were convinced that it was good. They decided to transfer this business model, Nespresso business model, inside the exploitation portfolio. And during 25 years, they knew a 2-digit growth, reaching here maybe 6 or 7 billion with one product line. A couple of years ago, because some patents ended, this business model became progressively at risk because some competitors came with fake capsules, and on some market reaching 20-25% of market share. So it was not decreasing the profit or the return of this business model, but the risk was higher. And so the reaction of Nestlé was to improve this business model. So they created a B2B part of this business model for reaching restaurants, hotels here. They also had created a new line for the North American market, and they have acquired this Starbucks. So it's possible now to have capsules with the brand Starbucks inside some retailers. And with those initiatives and those improvements, they were able to reduce the risk and to come again on the right-hand side, reducing the risk. Okay, so at exploration level, it's a very complicated process, which is very similar to the startups. So it means it's a search activity. So when you have an idea, you try to test those ideas and trying to reduce the risk and maybe to increase the return, the potential return. So as Alex mentioned it at the beginning, it's two main activities. The first one here is trying to increase the potential return of those business models using some design thinking techniques, ideation, prototyping, simulating, assessing. And here on this axis, the idea is to reduce the risk using some testing activity, detecting the hypothesis, testing with experiments, and learning and trying to see if we need to come back again at design or if we can continue and persevere with your business model or pivot. Okay, so the idea at this level is we would like to reduce the risk, okay, here, reduce the risk here with some testing activity. So it means that from a funding or financing perspective, at the beginning, you try to put some small amount of money to have some very premature testing activity. And then if you are able to reduce the risk, you can put more money to be able to test and to reduce this risk. And when you are convinced that the risk has been reduced with your testing activity, you can launch, you can transfer your business model inside the exploitation portfolio, and you can go. But one of the issues is it's not possible to detect those good business models a priori before to test those activities. So it means you know that you will have some failures. You hope that some will be successful, and that's the idea. I have a question for you, and maybe you can use the chat room to guess something. How many innovation projects you need to launch to produce a big success? So the question is, how many business idea that you launch at exploration level to reach one of the big success? So a big success could be a $1 billion dollars, and maybe here you invest 100,000 per project. So the question for you is trying to guess how many projects you need to launch to reach a big success. I will wait 15, 20 seconds, and you can maybe type inside the chat room, and you will see if you guess the correct number, and I will give you an idea or an answer in a few moments. Okay, 50 projects, 20. Oh. 200. 1,000. 1,000 by 100,000 means a lot of money. So if you want to recuperate your investment, will be maybe a little bit difficult. 500. Okay, let me stop, and I will try to show you an idea that we have. It's a theoretical idea. We think that it's around 250 projects. Among those projects, it's quite sure that 2/3 will fail, and maybe 1/3 could be a kind of medium success if you want. So it means that you will be able to launch 80 projects for reaching one big success at the end after a couple of years, 5 or 10 years. Why we think it's 250? It's because we have seen a statistics published on 10 years of activity of venture capital activity in United States. And you can see that 6 out of the 10 investment lose money, so returns less than what you have invested. 3 of our 10 projects returns 5 times, 10 times, on 20 times, and only 4 out of 1,000, that's the reason why we think that it's 250, will return 50 times more than what you have invested. This is a theoretical. So this one is for startups. It's not necessarily for existing or big company. But we have a nice illustration. Inside Bosch, they launch an acceleration program, and they accept every semester roughly 25 teams. So it means in the last 3 years, they have in total accepted 200 teams. They give them 3 months and 120,000 euros to test their ideas and to improve their first idea. After a couple of months, 3 months, they have a second selection. And during this selection, they have accepted in the last 3 years 60 teams. They give them again 300,000 to go further, to test, to improve their business model, maybe to pivot a little bit their ideas, and to continue. So it means that at this level, the second selection, they have 70% failure. Then those teams can continue, and during this third selection here, they have accepted 15 businesses. So again, 70% fail. So it means that here is something like only 7% of projects have been accepted out of those 200. And so we don't know exactly which among those 15 projects will be a big success in the future. So here we have the responsible of this acceleration program, Yves Pigneur, and they say they have been allowed to implement a fast, structured, capital efficient process for validating business models at scale and has led to the establishment of the Bosch-wide innovation portfolio. Nice illustration. So it means for us that it's a kind of funnel here. You need to have a lot of projects at this level in the exploration to be able to push some business model inside this exploitation portfolio. So it means that you cannot pick the winner without investing in those projects. And so you will have some failures, maybe 2/3, and so you will have some success here. We have seen, we have seen two different topics here. One is, how is it possible to measure the performance inside those business models? And the second one is, how is it possible to select the good business model and to have a selection which is based on not on intuition, but on some rational. So the first one was we came with some innovation metrics at different level. So at the hypothesis, business model, and exploration. So it means that we have here some way of some new KPIs trying to measure the risk reduction and the potential return. And so it means that based on this kind of assessment here during the testing activity, we could have some business model that we could put inside this portfolio on those two axes: potential return, expected return, and here the risk reduction. That's first. Second, we have seen that it's not so easy for top executives to choose those business models that they continue, as we have seen inside Bosch. So we came with what we call a project scorecard, meaning a way of measuring or evaluating the value of the project, not based on intuition, but some insight that we have, or the teams have collected during the testing activity. And based on this one, it's possible to put those one and to use the Explore portfolio to map and to choose if you continue, if you persevere, if you stop some projects. So you can take decision which is not based on intuition, but based on rational. And now Alex will continue. I will stop sharing here for the second part.
Okay, so Yves, there was one question about, how do you move from explore to exploit? And you explained that, right, with the scorecard. It's all about evidence. So we can come back to that a little bit later on in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Because the old measures, IRR and NPV don't really matter here, but those are execution metrics. So I'm going to zoom into competing on business models before we get to culture. Because we still see a lot of companies that just compete on product, price, and maybe technology, and that's just not good enough. So what do we mean with business model
Share
pattern?
the screen, Alex.
Yes? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's more interesting than seeing my talking head. There we go.
That's good.
Good now? Okay.
Yeah.
So just very quickly, so we're going to talk about business model patterns, because we still see a lot of companies that don't understand how to use business models. You can really outperform your competitors in the field if you start thinking more business models. And what we mean with that is this idea of configuring building blocks in a specific way to outperform competitors. When you understand business models, there are three things you will do well. You will design better business models, but you can also assess either your ideas or your existing business units, because you can improve business models. Second one, you'll be able to disrupt entire industries and arenas and transform yourself. And the third one, as a leader, a couple of leaders maybe in this call, you can really question your teams, or if you're an investor, question the companies you work for. If you're a team lead, question your team in order to improve the business model. Not the product, not the price, but the business model, okay? Product and price are very, very hard to be the only way to compete. So we have two types of business model patterns. We created a library of those. The first one is when you start from scratch here, from a green field, you can use these patterns as an inspiration to create a better business model around a market opportunity, around a technology, around a product. And then the second one is shifting existing business models to new ones. And that could be for a small company or for an established company. You don't start from a green field, you start from your existing business model. And then you can look at this pattern library and ask yourself, how could I improve my business model? For example, moving from transactional revenues to recurring revenues. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples now. So let's start with this idea of invent patterns. The whole idea of searching for better business models for the opportunity, for the idea, for the innovation you're working on. So again, quick repetition. We're talking about patterns here, and I'm going to illustrate it with a case. But I want you to keep this idea of library in mind. There are many different patterns, you know, like comes from architecture and software, and we can use them as an inspiration. So we have three types here. Front stage disruption, so related to how, you know, which markets you target, how you deliver value, etc. Second one is more the backstage, as I called it at the beginning of the business model. It's how you configure resources, how you make a business model more scalable, etc. And the last one, very interesting, how do you disrupt the profit formula? Finding different ways of earning money and spending money and creating a more profitable business. So I'm going to zoom into one that we call gravity creators. And that's more of a front stage business model pattern. And the idea here is having a new value proposition, targeting a specific customer segment, but with this new value proposition, we're able to lock in customers. We create so-called switching costs. And because the customer is locked in, right? So let me draw a little lock here. It allows us to increase the customer lifetime value. That means we can make more money from the customer over a period of time. So what does this allow to do? When we understand these kind of patterns and we have sub-illustrations, we can ask better questions, trigger questions. How could we make it difficult for customers to leave and increase, because we're increasing switching costs? So how can we lock them in a positive way? A wonderful example, and here I'm using a historic example, is the iPod. And the reason we use this is because everybody with the iPod saw a technology innovation, which it was. But the strategy by Steve Jobs was actually a business model strategy. So if I illustrate this, it was about reaching a mass market here with this whole idea of 1,000 songs in a pocket. Remember, Steve Jobs pulled out the iPod from his pocket and said, it's the first time we can put 1,000 songs in a pocket into the iPod, into iTunes. And what he did with that is when you put 1,000 songs into your software, into your product, it's actually very hard to switch. So Apple was able to lock in customers. What did that mean? It meant that customers, the next time they would upgrade their device, would come back and buy an Apple device again, because it's annoying to switch to a different company. They would sell that through retail. And as I said, they did need technology innovation there, hardware and software, okay, here in order to do this. But the real strategy here was not a technology innovation. The real strategy was to lock in customers. And then, of course, which company disrupted Apple with the iPod and iTunes? Spotify killed the switching costs, right? Because with Spotify, you didn't need to put music onto your device anymore. You could just plug it in, right? So these patterns don't last forever. That's why you need to reinvent yourself constantly to stay ahead, even for companies like Apple. Now, what's interesting once you understand this is you can start to assess your ideas or your existing business units. So we created these assessment questions. So when you have an idea that you're exploring, you can ask, how easy or difficult is it for our customers to leave or to switch to another company? So the question then is, okay, our customers are locked in for 10 years, not because they like your product, but because they can't leave. Like with the switching costs here in Apple, you put all your music in there, hard to leave. So you give yourself a high score. Just because you have a great brand and great quality doesn't mean your customers are locked in, Because if your customers can switch from today to tomorrow or next week, you have very low switching costs and you need to give yourself a negative score. But the interesting thing is negative scores always mean an opportunity to reinvent your business model and potentially even disrupt an industry or arena. So here we saw one of these patterns, okay? And there are several, and you need to assess every one of your ideas or your existing business unit to ask yourself, how good is the design of my business model? Not your product, not your price, not the quality, not the technology. That's great. You need to have that. But more interesting, how can you actually create better business models? So the assessment questions allow you to assess, and then the patterns allow you to improve. Okay, so that's for inventing stuff. Now let's look at the shift patterns, where it's about moving from one business model to another. So that is this part here, where Yves presented Nestle. And he showed a little bit, what on a big picture scale, what Nespresso did at Nestle to improve their business model portfolio. So here the idea is, if I go back to this little drawing, we start from an original business model. We have an idea of a pattern. How could we improve our business model? And we create a new business model, okay? That's the idea here. And just like with the other patterns, we have a library. How could we create better business models or shift our business models around the value proposition? How could we shift our business models in the front stage? And I'll give you an example of that in a second. How could I shift my business model from a resource perspective? Or how could I shift my business model from a profit formula perspective? So 4 different categories of shifts, and you can use each one of these as an inspiration. So all of these here are patterns, okay? So you have 4 times 3 patterns, 12 big picture ideas of how you can improve your business model. So let's go into front stage driven shifts for a second. And this means a radical shift of who you're targeting and how your products and services are delivered. And here I'm going to use a very simple example, very famous one, right, because it's easy to follow, okay? We're going to look at how we can move from a niche business model, targeting a niche market, and then apply the mass market pattern, because mass market is very different from a niche market. And we're going to illustrate this. And just like we've seen with the questions before, you can use these trigger questions for leaders in order to spark inspiration. And this is a very simple case, right? So there are a bit more challenging ones that can really shift your industry. So the example I'm going to use is TED. So I'm sure many of you, in confinement have watched TED Talks over the last couple of weeks. So TED started out as a very niche business. It was a conference here, had a business model for conference, an invite-only niche conference for the intellectually curious. So it was very, very limited and only accessible to a small group. And then they moved from conferences to streaming. So you can think of it, oh, that's a different product. Yes, that's true, but it's a completely different business model. And that's what's interesting here. So if you want, we had a niche business model. They said, oh, how could we move to mass market to make all of these wonderful ideas accessible to everybody? And they shifted to a mass market with the TED Talks online, okay? Oops, got the K. So that's an interesting shift. Now, in terms of shifts, you might have several patterns that you can combine. So a wonderful example is one of the most sustainable companies in the world is Ørsted. So if you don't know that company, get some inspiration there. They moved from oil and gas to 100% renewable, okay? And they were the first company to really do this on a large scale. And the way they did this is actually by applying several patterns. So this was an oil and gas company. They had the business model of an oil and gas company. And then they used several patterns. They used the backstage pattern. So from one resource, oil and gas, to reusing those skills and competencies for several areas. They moved from a relatively low-tech business, oil and gas, to very high-tech. Okay, some would disagree when I say oil and gas is low-tech, but some of it is. And then the last one, really interesting, also thinking of this now, they moved from transactional to recurring revenues, right? Because oil and gas is very volatile, depends on transactions, and renewable energy is a lot more stable and predictable. Now think of it, seems like a very obvious shift, but it's very difficult for an established company to completely transform their entire business, and that's exactly what they did. So it's interesting here, we also have these questions for leaders for all of these 12 patterns. So you can ask yourself here, the pattern from low tech to high tech. But I would also emphasize, there's not just one direction. There is no right business model, because sometimes you can go from high tech to low tech. I wonder if you think of a business model that went from a high tech industry to a lower tech industry. Wonderful example that I always like is Nintendo Wii. When the Nintendo Wii launched as a game console, they actually launched, from a technology point of view, an inferior technological platform to competitors. But the business model they used and the value proposition was very different. They actually targeted here casual gamers with a fun console, technologically pretty simple, which allowed them to decrease costs substantially and actually increase profits and revenue substantially, because they were targeting mass market. So think of it. Innovation can mean less technology to create more profits. That's what I want you to keep in mind, this counterintuitive stuff. And you can only do that when you understand business models, okay? Last one, see how we're doing on time. Establishing an innovation culture. Now here, it's all about the leadership you bring to the game. And this is leadership as a startup entrepreneur, but it's leadership also as a small and medium company leader or a very large company. And that is what really matters here, because as a leader, your job is not to pick the right ideas. As Yves showed you, you can't pick the winners. Your job is to create conditions for growth, meaning the right culture in terms of leadership, in terms of metrics, in terms of how you work, how you organize the org chart. That's the only thing you need to work on as a leader. It's not about your ideas. Extremely important. Why is that so hard for most companies? Is because we have these patterns, thinking patterns that come from execution. People think it's all about finding the right idea. No, it isn't. People think it's about executing a great plan. In innovation, no, it isn't. In execution, it is. It's about avoiding failure. No, in innovation, you need to embrace failure to learn, cheap failure, okay? And then often the biggest risk is to try to predict the future based on the past, but the past can be very different. So that culture that actually works pretty well in the top right-hand corner in the execution, exploit culture, doesn't work very well down here. So the question is, how can we design an innovation culture? And that's what we're really going to look at, because that is the key that not very many companies master yet. They often master the tools, but they don't master the designing of the culture. So doesn't mean you need to throw away your exploitation culture, how to manage your business. You need that, that's good, but you need to create an additional culture, because it's all about the and here. So this one here is really important. You need to create an exploration culture and an exploitation culture at the same time, under the same roof, which makes that very hard. So for that, of course, we invented a tool, because we're obsessed by using visual tools that allow us to make the conversation more concrete. This guy here, Dave Gray, some of you might have heard of Dave Gray. He came to Yves and me and said, guys, I have a lot of research on culture. I've been reading all of this stuff, but I want to create a simple tool so I can map culture in general and make it visible so we can design it and manage it. And we helped him do that with Yves. So you can see that how we make tools. Actually, we went through several iterations until we came up with this thing called the culture map. Now, we're going to use it in this little session just for designing an innovation culture, but you can use it in any way to design culture. So there are three big components you need to look at to design culture. First one is, what are the behavioral patterns in your company? How do people work? I mean, how do people work? Why do we need to understand that? Because how people work, the behaviors, lead to specific outcomes. In our case, we're interested in innovation outcomes, innovation results. But if people don't work how you need to work to create innovation, you won't get innovation, okay? Now, we can't directly work on behaviors. We can only work on this bottom aspect here, which we call enablers and blockers here. These are the things we can work on. We can take away the blockers, the things that prevent people from innovating, and we can put in place the enablers. Now, what Dave Gray likes to say is you can't design culture like you design a car, but you can design culture how you design a garden. And what he means with that is here you have the fertile ground that you can work on, the enablers and blockers, and that will lead to certain behaviors, and that will allow an innovation culture to blossom. But if you don't work on this, you just put up posters, you know, our ping pong tables is the funny thing we like to say in Silicon Valley, you will never get the behaviors required to innovate. And that's a very hard thing, in particular for established companies. So let's look very quickly at exploration culture. How do you design an exploration culture? So innovation emerges. There are basically three things you can work on, three enablers. Leadership support, what do you need to do as a leader? Organizational design, what kind of org charts and structures do you put in place? And the innovation practice, the tools, this is the easiest part. Here, you know, I think in most companies, innovation is innovation theater because it doesn't have a strategic importance and clout. And if it doesn't have strategic importance and clout, you won't see the behaviors required. Very briefly, here, if we take leadership support, what kind of behaviors do we need from leaders? The CEO needs to spend at least 40% of his or her time on innovation. Leaders need to be eager to pioneer. We need to look at our portfolio every quarter, and we need to provide clear guidance to the team how to innovate. Now, if we look at organizational design, we need people to collaborate between execution and innovation. We need, okay, to not fire people because they experimented. In execution, if you make a mistake, you fire people, but here you don't. And then in the innovation practice, you know, we need to choose ideas based on evidence. Oh, we talked to 100 people. We made a pricing test, not the opinion of the highest paid person in the room with the best looking business card. That is not what you should do. Because if you do that, you will never get innovation. And the reason why we want these behaviors across the board is because we want certain outcomes, right? We want innovation and growth. You can't get growth from just making your existing business model better over the longer term. Short term, that can work. You want to leverage the assets you have in your company, small or big, okay? You want to reduce the risk of innovation because people often think innovation is risky. It's not risky if you do it right. Remember what Yves showed you with the portfolio map? If you start with many ideas and then like Bosch, you kill ideas, you will find the winner. Here, small amounts of money, here, bigger investments. Innovation is not risky and it's not expensive if you do it right. R&D and scientific and technology innovation is expensive, but that is not a prerequisite to innovate. Now, as a recommendation, the first thing to do in terms of creating an innovation culture is actually very simple. You just need to kill the blockers, okay? Just kill the blockers that are preventing you from innovating today. So I'll give you one. Where is it? So we have one here somewhere. You know, business plans is one that you want to eliminate. If you're still asking for business plans here, if we had that one somewhere over here, business plans are actually the killer of innovation. But look at these blockers, and I think you're going to get the recording of this so you can take a snapshot of the screen or get the slides after. You want to kill these blockers. What you do want to do is in these three areas that I showed you, In terms of leadership support, you want to work on these three aspects. In terms of organizational design, you want to work on these three aspects. And in terms of innovation practice, you want to work on these three aspects. Now, given that we have very little time, we won't go much deeper. If you want to know more, you can always go to our virtual masterclass that's going to take place in May, where we look at all of this in very much detail and show you how to do it, okay? But I can only give you a teaser today together with Yves. So the reason we do this, first one here, in terms of leadership support, is because with the right leadership support, this is what we get. Strategic guidance. You need to guide your team. What do? You need to allocate resources, and that's not just money, that's time of the senior leadership. And you need to actively manage the portfolio every single quarter together with the team. Here's a big one. Give innovation legitimacy and power. So it can't be that you hire somebody out of university and say, oh, young and fresh thinking, you know, we're going to hire a person out of university to do innovation, because what's going to happen, nobody in the company is going to take that person seriously. You need senior leaders who have affinity for innovation, who have legitimacy and clout to lead innovation. And then here, rewards and incentives. If you punish people who fail, you will never get innovation. And I'm not talking about big failure, I'm talking about experimentation. If you don't fail, you're probably not working on innovation. The system you put in place to manage this failure systematically and keep it cheap, that's what allows you to get big innovation. Then bridging the execution engine and the innovation engine. So quick question, maybe you can type it into the chat window, and I'm going to try to bring it up. How much time does your CEO, or if you're the CEO, you know, personally spend on innovation every week? So maybe you can quickly type that into the chat window. And I'll try to bring up the chat window here so I can see it. Is it 0%? Is it, you know, 20%? 20% would be 1 day per week. Is it 10%? Maybe just type how much time. 20% says, we just already, so that's nice. That's already 1 day. Reza says 10%, that's half a day, maybe not that much. 3 days a week is great, okay? 10%, that's actually not too bad. Okay, you maybe saw every time, the whole time, 80% is good, good. So as you saw maybe, we said something else than what we see in reality. So I do this every now and then. I put a Twitter post out there. So most companies, it's not enough, right? 10%, 0 to 10% is not enough. Now, if you don't want innovation, that's okay. But if you want innovation, you should be more, you know, somewhere down here, 25 to 50%, okay? And if you're a startup, obviously it's 100% because that's all you're doing. So the way you actually can organize this is, we'll give you a great example, and I'll finish with that almost, is maybe beside the CEO, the boss who takes care of exploitation, of managing the existing, you could put in place a chief entrepreneur whose only job is to focus on innovation. And there is a company who does that, a company that does that really well, and that is Ping An. Ping An was a banking and insurance conglomerate about a decade ago, until they said, we want to be a technology company. And Peter Ma, the founder here, he said, we're going to get disrupted, right? Banking and finance. It was a big company, top 300 of the world, top 300 companies of the world. He said, we're going to get killed. We need to become a tech company. That was his vision. Okay? Let me draw a little thinking bubble here. Right? He was afraid of getting disrupted. So he put in place a co-CEO who was technically the chief entrepreneur, Jessica Tan, and her only job was to explore. And what's interesting here, he said, Jessica, you're not going to get it right. You're going to fail a lot. So he actually instructed her to be bold and fail, because he knew that failure leads to success. If you fail enough and you have a strategy of where you want to go, you'll actually create success. So that's what they did. And now they're in the top 30 companies of the world. The last piece here is innovation tools. That's the easiest one. So you might want to start with that. Is how do you put in place the right tools and processes and skills? And I believe innovation is a profession. It's not something you easily do overnight or at a workshop or at a, you know, a 1 hour talk with even myself. It's something you need to learn. And what goes with that in terms of tools is, yes, in a company, you need to be able to manage this portfolio map. You need to have a vision of your corporate identity, and you need to design the culture to create that. And if we zoom in more granularly, and these are the tools from the past, right? You need to understand business models, value propositions, the business model environment. And then the last one, the tools of testing. So we published that in our last book, Testing Business Ideas. You need to understand how exactly to test ideas, because there was one question about how do I know which ideas to pick? You don't know. You have to put in place a system that generates evidence so the teams test. So if you're interested in understanding if your company has the ability to innovate, you can score yourself, and we call this the Innovation Culture Readiness Scorecard. So you can download that. You can go through the questions I showed you now, and you can give yourself a score. So you can download it and score. How good is your leadership support for innovation? How good is your organizational design? And how good is your innovation practice? So you can score yourself on 9 questions. And if you have a really good score everywhere, you can write to Yves and me and we'll make you a case study. And if you're over here, don't be frustrated. This equals opportunity, okay? Because there are very few companies in the world today that are like Amazon or like Ping An. It's a great opportunity to be a leader these days because you can stand out very easily. I think there's a bigger opportunity than ever before. So question is, are you ready for innovation? We hope you learned something. So here's how it all fits together. Again, from the vision you have to the portfolio and business models and the culture you need to create. Interested in more? Just Google the Invincible Company. You can download 100 pages for free. Some of you in the chat already said you were reading the free pages and now you're eagerly waiting for the book. And as I said, there's the masterclass as well, where we talk about all of these different topics for you to really become an invincible company. We really believe that it is possible to constantly innovate. So thank you from us. And I think we have maybe a couple of minutes for Q&A.
Yes. Awesome. This is a very interesting presentation. Actually, this is the first time that I heard about, you know, innovation from the perspective of a good organizational culture. So I have picked 3 questions already. First one is from Diki Zaryadi from Gagas Energy. Let me read that one. His question is to Alex. How do we assess the risk of disruption correctly? I mean, did Apple notice if the cloud music will replace the storage system card? How to identify it in the nowadays cross-boundary business competition? Should we put technology improvement risk as a priority threat in all industry? So
yeah, I think the awareness around, you know, disruption is only emerging. So there are, as we've seen, maybe I can go back to that if I find the slide. There is an awareness today that companies are really starting to look at, you know, are they ready for disruption assessment or not? So that was here, right? Yeah. Where we had a look at this. The first one you can clearly see is if your revenues, your margins are going down. So you can do that. A lot of companies are assessing that. This one here, yeah, for sure, a lot of companies are looking at that. So if you look at the technology players like Amazon, Apple, but also companies like Nestlé and Unilever, one of the things they're often looking at, and it's one of the questions in the scorecard. Let me see if I can show you this scorecard here. It is the trend assessment. So the big question that these companies are looking at is how much venture capital money is going into our industry, right? You can see that the venture capital in food industry, in drinks and snacks, went up, you know, dramatically. So guess what? That is an indicator for Nestlé that they're being disrupted. Okay? Venture capital money, or the number of startups, okay? And what's interesting here also to understand, take venture capital money, most startups are better financed than corporations, than corporate innovation projects, okay? So I believe money is now much more available for startups. So yes, these companies look at that. Do they use this particular assessment? No, not yet. This is only something emerging. We just started the research on this.
Okay.
Yves, anything? Yves
Yeah,
wants to add?
and it's not only money, it's also regulation evolution or technology evolution. So it means that you can look also at your competition environment or market forces and so on. So I think we try to have something which cover different issues that you could analyze or make some assumption or some scenarios for the future.
Yeah, and I would, taking the energy industry particularly, when the regulations change, that's an external disruption that can be substantial. Now, again, sometimes companies are aware of this disruption, but what they don't do is take action. So you actually need to take action before you even know you're being disrupted. So that's the big idea here.
Okay, so great. Let me just move to the next question. The question is to Yves. It's from Teddy Astriel, basically to Yves and Alex, but then, probably Yves can start answering the question first. His question is, during the quarantine period now in Indonesia due to COVID-19 effect and still running, mostly big corporates are facing hard time with reducing their capacity more than 50%. The market is also reached dormant condition. The business that's still running are for people basic needs and small, medium enterprise and home industry. Even they are hit pretty bad as well. Within these 3 weeks, I assist my clients and SMEs to change their strategy to market and conduct probably more than just exploit the business model. Could you share how profound the Invincible Company book approach that relevant with the new normal innovation after COVID outbreak with unpredictable global shifting of economy and technology? This is very interesting. I think like the organizational culture is pretty shifted, right, during this condition, especially like when everyone is working from home now. So what is your thought about it?
I think, as Alex started with, okay, initially we had an idea that if you want to be invincible, you need to reinvent yourself and so on. So, and Alex very quickly said, also to be resilient, you need also to be able to reinvent yourself. Here, it's a big, big crisis that we have never seen. Atomic bombs, as Alex sometimes mentioned. But I think the kind of techniques and cultural evolution and the different ways of reinventing your business model is still on the table, and it's maybe more important than before. So if you just operate and you just focus on execution, okay, that's good because it generates money. But if you are not able to explore and trying to maybe think to how to replace the traditional business or the usual business you are in, it will be also difficult to recover. So I think all the things that we try to cover in the last hour is something it's still meaningful. It's some technique that we could use to be able to recover, even if it's difficult. And there are some questions, okay, exploration is difficult and so on. Yes, it is. It's clear. It's complicated. In traditional or usual time, and it's more complicated now. But if you don't do, and if you don't explore, and you don't try to improve maybe some of your existing business model, it will be also complicated for you. Alex?
Yeah, I'd build on that in saying, when this part here dies or is not, valid anymore, this part here, exploration, becomes more important. And now you're forced to do it. Before, it was an external disruption, in the industry that would make it happen. This is just happening right now to everybody. And what I'm seeing a lot is big and bold ideas are very important now. But it doesn't mean making crazy investments in bold ideas. It means using all of these tools, that we showed. So the lesson, also to take away from this crisis is, if you've practiced this before, you are ready to do this during this crisis now. So you don't learn how to become a world-class innovator overnight. You're kind of forced to do it now. So now everybody has to. There is no other choice. Those that were already starting to do this before are very well prepared for this crisis, and they will come out stronger. But I would say, look, we can't change the environment. You need to see this as an opportunity. So yes, you need to preserve the cash. Yes, you need to take away everything that, you know, could kill you in the short term, but that's not enough. You really want to focus on how can I invent the future? Because every crisis, every recession, every depression is also a huge opportunity. And those that you know are the boldest and move ahead with confidence will, you know, leave many others behind. I see this as a great opportunity. Again, it's you know, for some industries very hard. If you're in the airline business, there's not that much you can do. If you're in tourism, it's also pretty hard. But in general, see it as an opportunity because you can't change the environment anyway. So you better work with it and make the best out of it.
Okay. So the next question is from Bapak Sabang Hutajulu from the Faculty of Economy from University of Indonesia, to all panelists, either Yves or Alex. So he said that, is it correct to say the exploration stage is quite expensive as this is a trial and error? And then he was working in the oil and gas industry for 30 years, and the success ratio for exploration is only about 1/30. And it is, you know, considered to be lucky. And he presumes that we need to have huge equity capital to manage exploration and exploitation. So what do you think about that, you know, in terms of managing the investment between exploration and exploitation?
I would actually say the contrary. So the whole presentation, you know, might have not made that point clear enough. But let me just put this here again, that what Yves showed is it's not risky and expensive if you do it right. And let me just emphasize, I'm not talking about R&D, you know, and scientific innovation per se. That can become very expensive. But this part here is not expensive if you do it right. So remember the Bosch example? We started cheap with many projects, and then we killed projects, and we only start to invest more the more we know. So here, it starts to get expensive. Here, it's very cheap. Okay, so that's why we say it's a funnel. And I do believe that if you just took your entire R&D budget, let's say R&D, you take 5% of your R&D budget, you're going to grow like crazy if you spend this amount of money from your R&D budget on value proposition and business model exploration. So I would counter that and say it does get expensive, but only here when you start to scale. There is a moment where you need to heavily invest, but this part here is not expensive. And again, like we showed with Bosch, I can go back to that one. With Bosch, we showed obviously something that is a bit of a larger scale because it's also a large company. This is a company that has 400,000 employees. Okay, so they started with 200 teams, but that doesn't mean that small companies here, they might not start with 200 teams. This was over 3 years. You can do the same thing with 10. And what we're seeing in the industry with our big, you know, pharma clients or banking clients, not all of them do this bold thing like Bosch. They start with 10 teams, sometimes with 5 teams. And you'll get one that goes up here. It won't be a multi-billion-dollar success, but it might make $10 million, okay? But it's not expensive. I think that's a big myth that at the beginning, and I can see, you know, how that in oil and gas, when we say innovation, we actually often think technology innovation. When you think technology innovation, yes, that can be expensive, but that's not a prerequisite to innovation. So I really would like to make the difference between technology R&D and business model R&D. Yves, anything you want to add to that?
Or maybe especially true for SMEs. So I think means that even small company could have maybe 5 or 10 projects in exploration just to be able to anticipate the declining business model they could have in the exploitation. So I think it's very key to keep in mind that it's not so expensive, but it's a voluntary process. It means that the top executives need to be convinced that exploration is a key for the future.
I would add to that last point from Yves. The problem is, and I see this from in the field, most leaders is they're world-class at execution, but for innovation is still a black box for them. And when innovation is a black box, there's these myths. Innovation is expensive, innovation is risky, innovation is all about the creative genius, it's about the right idea. All of that, you know, we now know how to do it. So when we work with companies, we educate the leaders, the very top, and we educate the doers. And if you don't do both, there's a disconnect. So most companies actually have pretty good innovation talent. There maybe many of you are in this little workshop. But if the leadership doesn't understand, you can have the best talent on the planet and it's not going to work. So what is really important is that the leaders need to understand how this works, and then it can happen, because it's bottom up and top down. If it's only bottom up, not going to work. If it's only top down, not going to work. It's both sides, right?
Okay, so that's very interesting because it is related to a question from someone here, Bobby from Telkomsel. If we can have like one more question before you leave. So he asked, you know, basically how can we persuade the leadership to continue innovation? Because a lot of times leadership always associate everything with costs and development, right? Meanwhile, you said that it has to be balanced between like from top bottom and then from bottom to the upper management level. So what do you think that people who are the doers can persuade the leadership to continue the innovation?
Yeah, Alex.
So maybe this one is a good start. You know, if you look at the outcomes and you ask leaders, do you want to continue to grow? Do you want a resilient company? You know, do you want to reduce the innovation risk? So you just need to ask the right questions. If you just try to motivate them with tools and, you know, principles and new books, it's not going to work. It depends on what leaders want. If they, you know, increasingly, it's getting riskier to do nothing than actually to really act dramatically. So, you know, I think it's just opening this black box and showing examples of companies that disappeared, because there are a lot of companies that are being disrupted, and then ask the leadership, look, do you think we are protected from competition for the next 10 years? Maybe you don't need to do this. But realistically, most leaders actually start to understand it's getting very, very dangerous to not deeply understand innovation. So I don't think it's that hard if you use the right words. And probably our favorite drawing, at least mine, to convince leaders to get started, it's very simple. I start with this and I show them these are two different worlds. This is the world we know. This is the world that we usually have at a company. This is the world we don't know. Do you want to survive? You need to do both. If you think you're fine with the business model of today, continue to do this. But most leaders are very aware. Research shows that, you know, over 80% of leaders are very aware that their business models are going to be disrupted. What they don't always understand is you don't need to change everything. You actually just need to add, it's an and, you need to add the exploration culture. So it's not that hard. It just needs leadership commitment. So I do think leaders are ready. They just don't always know how to do it, from my experience. Okay, this is a data point of one.
And also maybe, you know, big leaders has also to be reinsured. So it means that if we provide them with the right tool, maybe, but also, and we wanted to do that with Alex, is to provide them with some questions for leaders or innovation scorecard. So just to help them to say, okay, even if it's a world that I don't know well or less than exploitation, we could help them with the right questions or the right way of assessing the things, or coming with the right innovation metric to say, okay, two kinds of metrics, and with this kind of metrics, we will show you that it's possible to reduce the risk for you, or with the right techniques. Alex.
Yeah, so that is exactly, you know, what I think is important to reassure leaders. That's why we came up with innovation metrics, because when you can't measure it, it seems very fuzzy. So you need to show people this is a serious profession. So I do think reassuring leaders, we know how this works now. It's not a black box. You know, invest and do it right, or don't do it at all. There's always this, you know, people do it, they invest, but they don't do it right because they don't understand it yet. So I think portfolio management is now, you know, established. The processes are established. It's just leadership commitment. And once you reassure leaders that, you know, we know how to do this, and you show examples like Bosch, you show examples like Ping An, it's actually very positive, because now it's only a question, do you want to use this opportunity or not? And if a leader doesn't want to go, you know, towards new opportunity, that's okay. That's a choice. Not everybody wants to, you know, grow and keep their company alive. Maybe there's just a career of 3 years. I'll be retired. Doesn't matter if the company dies after my 3 years until retirement, but that's a choice. And it just needs to be a deliberate choice. I'd say when you invest in innovation, do it right, because we now know how to do it. When you don't want to invest in innovation, be aware of the consequences, and then you're fine. It needs to be a deliberate choice.
Okay, so I think that was the final question for today. We have answered all the questions. So I think that Alex and Yves have something else to do. We really thank you so much for the very insightful presentation. And for everyone, I would like to encourage everyone to purchase the book, The Invincible Company. You can just Google, and then you can start ordering it from Amazon or any other channel. And then, again, thank you so much. I'd like to share with you some very, very insightful, like beautiful quotes that I learned from today. The first one is about innovation can mean less technology to make more profit. And then also about leaders creating conditions for growth. Okay, so for everyone else, for all the participants, you can stay, but then for Yves and Alex, thank you so much again. It's a very great time for having you today. We hope that we can have another opportunities with you in the future. And we look forward to have information about your virtual masterclass.
Thank you, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
So,
Bye, thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.